I can't tell you how good it feels to stand up here and look at your smiling faces. I want you to know that I think about you folks all the time, and I'm so glad that I'm able to be up here with you on the Feast of Tabernacles. I hope you're having a wonderful time. I bring you greetings from the little few folks we have down in Panama City. We had about 190 folks down there, and my wife is desperately missing me today. And I told her, just hang on, I'll be home tonight. So she's they're having a wonderful time down there. We had a kids carnival here a day or so ago, and it was a real hit. And she told me all the sermons have been really good down there. Dr. Ricks just came back from there as well and heard good things about his sermon down there as well. And we just came from Indiana yesterday in Montgomery and had a warm crowd up there. I was able to spend some time with the ministers, as we had a ministers luncheon right before I left to come down here last night. And they're all positive, and they're doing really well, and told me to send their greetings and their love to you, all you folks down here. I love to read and study history. As I told the folks up in Montgomery, I really was surprised at the lack of history that I had when I was in high school. The little smattering, if you want to call it that, of American history, and then my senior year I took world history because my baseball coach was the teacher, and I knew he'd give me a passing grade, and that's about all he cared about was baseball. I don't hardly remember anything I learned from history in those classes that I had in high school. It wasn't until I became a young man that I even began to be interested at all at any aspect of history. To me, it was sort of boring. It was the past, and it was something that I really didn't care much about. But as I began to pick up little books and things of history and began to read, I realized that it was about the human saga, the human story. And so as I began to read, I realized that there was more to it than what I had imagined. You can study history, and I recommend if you want to pick up a book, but you could study about the American history, and it is a fascinating story. There are stories in the early American history such as the ones during the days that George Washington walked the earth, and the very close calls that we had in our country that could have gone the other way. You know, the story of Valley Forge, you know that story, how they got up that morning and sailed across the river there as the fog swept in and hid them from the British. I'm just finishing up another book about the spy ring that George Washington had, how he would send the spies into New York to spy out the British movements, and how close it was that Benedict Arnold, believe it or not, you know, he was the turncoat, the one that went with the British, American general that went with the British, and he was actually going to turn over Fort West Point while Washington was there. If that would have happened, it would have turned the whole dynamic of the war towards the British, and we would have lost the Revolutionary War. But in a way, I look and read those stories of how God had a hand in protecting and establishing this great nation. You can look into more recent history of the Louisiana Purchase. One of the fascinating things I read about the Louisiana Purchase was that Robert Livingston was over there and trying to negotiate with the French the purchase of the territory of New Orleans. And Jefferson had given him a purse of $10 million, a budget of $10 million. That was the top, the limit. But while he was there, the French were about to be engulfed in a war with the British. They'd already taken a black eye in their battle that they had in what is now modern-day Haiti. And so their quest for an empire in the West was beginning to wane. And so they were deeply in debt. They needed the money for the battle that they were about to have with Britain. And so they negotiated the sale of the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. That's about 3 cents an acre. And of course, Robert Livingston okayed the deal. He signed the deal. And I told the folks in Montgomery, how would you like to come back to the United States and tell your president, I spent 1.5 times what you told me was the top number? But he knew that this was a fantastic opportunity because in it doubled the size of the United States. We acquired almost 15 states. It went from Louisiana all the way up through Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, North and South Dakota, some of the states out west, and even 2 provinces in Canada, for pity's sake. What an enormous event that was, and what it did to create a vast nation that would grow and become the United States of America. And here we were on the verge of a civil war that broke out and cost the lives of 500,000 Americans. It almost tore our country apart, and I guess in some ways it did. But in some way we patched that war together and patched our nation back together. And I don't have to mention to you the 16 million people that lost their lives in World War I and over 50 million in World War II. The casualties that we had and the battles that we had during World War II that were very close to us losing the war. I can't imagine today standing here and thinking that our country was fighting a world war on 2 separate fronts. We were fighting, invading Normandy there, and that all by itself could have lost us the war. And we thought Britain thought they were going to have to go it alone there for a long time. And there we were with this massive invasion there on Normandy, but at the same time, halfway around the world, we're in the South Pacific, fighting a war against the Empire of Japan. It was a monster task, and one that could have gone in a number of occasions either way. Some of the stories that you can read in history about some of those captains and of those ships in the South Pacific, and some of those men had the bravest heart that you can imagine. They would run an American ship even when they were 4-1 odds against them. And some of them knew that they were going to die. And they did it anyway because they had a certain fight, a certain hunger to establish our nation, and they knew they had loved ones back home. And I say that because it was on many of those occasions that the pendulum could have swung the other way, and some foreign nation could have taken over the western half of our country. You can study British history, the Roman conquest, the Viking raids. I have mentioned William the Conqueror, how the Norman invasion, he came from that place called Normandy and sailed across the British Channel to establish the throne there in England, and had to go through all kinds of machinations and battles to try to reestablish the throne there. But I was telling the folks up there that while I was there, I saw a monument there. It was an old, like you would take some concrete and pour it out in a mold and just stand it up. It wasn't anything much more than that. But in that concrete was a cannonball. And I was there to visit because I was interested in the relics and the monuments having to do with World War II. And yet here was this ancient monument that was from World War I. And it made me realize that they had been fighting on this ground for centuries, even back to the time of William the Conqueror in 1066. And of course, there was the Scottish Reformation when Scotland broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. There was I mentioned the Irish potato famine in 1845 that cost almost 1 million people their lives, that starved to death. And it could have brought that nation to its knees. And of course, as I said, Britain had their own world war to face, and they thought they were going to have to go it alone because the Americans did not want to get into another world war. And yet, and you know the story of Dunkirk, how the Germans pushed the British all the way back to the sea. The English Channel was at their back. For some unknown reason, Hitler stopped those tanks for a couple of days, about 48 hours, to allow the British to, in boats and fishermen's boats and yachts, to escort, to evacuate that British army off the shores there, back to Britain, where they could reestablish that army and regather themselves. And of course, after that began the plans for the invasion of Normandy. Had that British army not stopped, they would have decimated the British army of 250,000 men. And the history pages would look a lot different than they do today. And of course, there was the Battle of Britain, where the Luftwaffe tried to bomb Britain, and of course, the wonderful pilots of the RAF, the Royal Air Force, pushed them back and turned the tide of the war. You can study ancient Greece, you can study the Assyrians, you can study the ancient Persians. As I have mentioned before, I've seen artifacts and murals where those ruthless Persians would go into a city and they'd pile up the heads in a pyramid in the city to instill fear around the world, around the nations that they were invading. And of course, you could study ancient Egypt and all that there is to do with the pyramids and the Sphinx and all of their hieroglyphics and the tombs that they have. You could spend a lifetime studying that, and I haven't even begun to mention the empire of the Roman Empire, the history that's associated with the Roman Empire. It's a fascinating story, but I will bet that you can't look in any textbook in the United States today, and you would look in vain to find one mention in a high school textbook and perhaps even a college textbook of the mention of ancient Israel. You know, out of all of the history books that I've ever read, and I've not read that many of them, but the best history book that we have is the one that is laying on your laps right now or on the table in front of you. The Bible, the Holy Word of God. Because in it is the story of man. And it goes all the way back to the beginning of man. And God, you know, He created mankind, and He called a man named Abraham because of his righteousness and his faithfulness. And through his family, we have this fantastic story of Abraham. And even while Abraham's grandchildren were alive, Abraham and Isaac and then Jacob, we know how they went down into Egypt, and they were there for 430 years in slavery. And God brought them out of the nation of Egypt from captivity, and He gave them His divine laws and statutes. I had jokingly said that I load the dishwasher every once in a while and help Judy out in the kitchen because she hates loading the dishwasher. She don't mind unloading it, but she hates loading it. I'm the other way. I don't mind loading it because I don't care how they go in there. She does. But, you know, the fact that we wash dishes before we eat out of them, the fact that we have underground sewage systems and all of those things, you know, as they did back in the early American days when, you know, when the sewer bucket got full, they'd just pour it out the second-story window. How'd you like to be walking down the sidewalk? But all of those things of cleanliness and hygiene came from God's instructions. They were laws and statutes that God gave the nation of Israel because He wanted to elevate them above these rotten, pagan, third world countries that were living all this squalor and disease. They were worshiping all these pagan gods, sacrificing their children to their pagan gods on the sacrificial fires. And God wanted to reach out and grab that nation and elevate them above that. He wanted them to be the shining example to the world, the light to the rest of the world. Oh no, we can't have them rotten laws of God. But in them, most people today are unaware that they are obeying those laws, even if through ignorance. Our country and our nation was established on those beautiful laws. So in that history, as I said, the Bible is the most fascinating history book of all time. It tells us of the nation of Israel, how they were born, and from the faith, as I said, of Abraham. And in those fabulous laws and instructions that God gave the nation of Israel came this idea of Leviticus 23 and the keeping of God's holy days. If you'll turn with me to Leviticus 23, and I know you probably have already read these scriptures, and I won't belabor them, down in verse 34, it tells us that he told Moses, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 15th day of the 7th month shall be a feast of tabernacles." We know that this is God's calendar, not the Gregorian calendar, which was, Gregory established the Gregorian calendar so he could adjust the dates for Easter worship. But God had a different calendar in mind. The priests were going to look into those green ears and say, this is the beginning of months for you, which is about March or April. And we would count from that month 7 months, and that brings us to, in God's time calculations, to the 7th month. And that's where we are today. And on the 15th day of the month, you did like I did. You walked out and saw that big full moon, and you knew we were right on time. We were right at the Feast of Tabernacles. He said, the 15th day of the 7th month shall be a Feast of Tabernacles, a feast of temporary dwelling places. I said that the surrounding nations probably thought those ancient Israelites were half crazy, because they looked out there across the plains and they saw all these Israelites moving out of their homes, building a little shack out of there of wood and sticks and boughs of trees and limbs and moving into them. They probably thought those people were crazy. And the reason I know that is because they thought we were crazy when I was a kid, and I'd go over to Big Sandy and we'd spend the whole Feast of Tabernacles out there, and there'd be thousands of people camped out in tents. And the locals there said, those people are crazy. What are they doing out here for 8 days camping out? I know y'all had a little unfortunate event here of having to move out of this building for a couple of days. But the thought crossed my mind. We weren't meant to be here on a permanent basis. We, like the Israelites, have had to move around, haven't we? And move out of our home. And what a prime example of that. Even right here at the feast, the trials that we've had to endure over time. He says, and on the first day shall be a holy convocation, and the last day, we know that there was going to be a holy day on the first and the last day, down in verse 39. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land. I love these little fruit stands that have all of these great big pumpkins and these shocks of dried corn stalks. And it makes me realize that we're right here at the fall of the year when those mums are blooming, and it's such a beautiful time of the year. So it's a fall harvest. And you shall take with you the first day boughs of goodly trees and branches of palms and boughs of thick trees and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And you shall keep a feast of the 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generation. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. There it is. I had this conversation, and I reminded the folks up there in Montgomery with a dear lady that I have at the office. We began sort of a conversation about politics, and it ended up gravitating towards our ages and where we're heading in our country. And eventually, we landed on religion. And this was one of those conversations where I'm trying to get away from work to go home. And then all of a sudden, she drops this line on me that the Roman Catholic Church was the very first church. Well, I couldn't leave that. So I told her, I walked back in her office. I was had my head stuck in her door of her office, little cubicle there, and was just, trying to say, y'all, I'll see y'all tomorrow or to the next day or whatever. And this was right before the feast. I said, no, wait a minute now. Jesus Christ is the one who established the church. He was there, the one that formed the very first church along with the disciples. And on the day of Pentecost, when God's Spirit fell on those men, that was the birth of the church. Those disciples went out and began to preach what Jesus had told them, what he had revealed to them. And throughout the writings of the Apostle Paul, who preached the gospel to the Gentiles, we have all of his letters and all of his writings, who wrote most of the books in the New Testament. And John was the one who finished out the New Testament writings. Probably wrote in about 90 A.D. as a very elderly man on the Isle of Patmos. The very last chapter we have that was recorded in the New Testament was by the Apostle John, who was an eyewitness of Jesus Christ. And then, as if a curtain was brought over the second century, that all ended at the very last of the first century. We have no writings from the second century. What emerged in the third century in the Council of Nicaea in 325 A.D., under the Roman domination of Constantine, who was a sun worshiper, was the debate on whether they should keep the 14th of Nisan, the Passover on the 14th of Nisan, or Easter. And the other debate that they had was whether they were going to worship on Sunday as opposed to the seventh-day Sabbath, because they didn't want anything to do with anything that was Jewish. I tell you, the lady's mouth dropped open when I told her this. She was standing there looking at me like she had heard some foreign language. And I told her, that's when the change took place. And that's when the influence of the Roman Catholic Church began. Well, I don't have to believe that. No, you don't. You don't have to believe that. Well, do you have any books that I can read? How many dozen do you want? I didn't know which books. Boy, I went home and I thought about that. I thought, man, which book can I give her? I thought about all the books that I have in the study of that subject, and I settled on the America and Britain in Prophecy, and a copy of our latest edition of 21st Century Watch magazine. I put it in an envelope and left it on her desk right before we came to the feast. And I prayed that maybe that seed will be planted. I don't know how long it'll take to grow, but I tell you what, she heard something she had never heard before. That this idea that these laws were given strictly to the Jewish people, when it tells us here clearly that this was for the nation of Israel. And I told her, you know, Jacob had 12 sons, not just one. One of them was called, I listed them off for her, all the 12 sons. It was only one of them became the progenitor of the Jewish people. There were other nations that were part of the nation of Israel, and that these instructions, these laws were applied to all of the nation of Israel. And we read that right here when he says, all that are Israelite born. And that's exactly what it was. We know that God gave his holy days. He said that he was going to be their God and they would be his people. He said, I will dwell with you. And he did. He came down and rested there in the temple with them. He was the fire by night and the cloud by day that led them. He said, as long as you obey these commandments, I will be here with you. I will dwell with you. For all the time the Israelites were in the wilderness, they kept the holy days, along with the time in which they entered the promised land under Joshua. They kept the holy days. Even up to the time of David and his son Solomon, they kept the Sabbath day as a people. We know that they had a civil war, not unlike the one we had here in the United States, where they eventually divided between the northern and the southern tribe of Judah. Those 10 tribes in the north were carried away. They were led away from the truth of God by Jeroboam, that king that decided he was going to erect these golden calves up and said, here's your gods, O Israel. And he also established the feast in the 8th month so the people wouldn't go back and migrate down to Jerusalem and reestablish their religious fervor for the true God. And so from that point forward, the northern tribes were led away from God, and eventually they turned their back on God so many times that he carried them away captive by the Assyrians. Same thing happened to the tribe of Judah in the south under Nebuchadnezzar. He carried them away captive for 70 years. Some of those ancient people And some of the children were born in Babylon, grew up and were 70 years old when eventually under Cyrus they were allowed to return to Jerusalem to begin to build the foundation of the temple once again because it had been destroyed. You know the story. It tells us that some of those ancient men that had been young boys when they went away into captivity dropped to their knees and began to weep when they laid the very foundation stones of the temple, because they remembered the temple in its former glory. And it was an emotional time for them. And it was a national time of reformation, if you want to call it that. And in the 15 years later or so, when Nehemiah came back to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, the same thing happened. And Ezra was probably about 100 years old by this time, a very elderly man, probably one of the very few could read and understand the Hebrew language, got up and read in God's law where it says they read that they were to keep the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month. And so they kept the Feast of Tabernacles. It says it was one of the best feasts they had ever had in all of the history of the nation of Israel. They worshiped and kept the Feast of Tabernacles, doing exactly what you're doing here today. And as I said, they had a national reformation, so much that the Levites and the priests and the princes all signed a document, an oath that they would obey God. How would you like to have that happen in our nation today? Wouldn't that be a spectacle? To have the leadership absolutely turn to God. We know that Jesus kept the feast. His parents went down to Jerusalem. They went on every Sabbath day, I'm sure somewhere in a local congregation, or made these pilgrimage down to Jerusalem. The disciples kept the Sabbath day and the holy days. They were there on the Passover and the days of unleavened bread during the time of Jesus walked the earth. They were there for the Lord's Supper. They were there at Pentecost, as I said, on a holy day when the church was born. And you remember how the disciples tried to get Jesus to go down to Jerusalem during the days of the Feast of Tabernacles. And he wouldn't go because the Scripture tells us that he wouldn't walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. He knew if he went too early that he wouldn't fulfill his entire commission while he was on this earth. And so he delayed his arrival at the Feast of Tabernacles, but when he did get there, he got up and he preached a powerful sermon, insomuch that they said, "Who is this carpenter? Out of his mouth are coming these words like he's some educated man, and yet he's a carpenter." And they were astounded at his doctrine. In Acts, the 18th chapter, I'd like to go there if you would. Acts, the 18th chapter. The Apostle Paul traveled all over the known world. He kept the Sabbath day. He would go, and time again it tells us that he went in the synagogue on the Sabbath day and preached over and over again. Acts the 18th chapter, down in verse 21, it tells us, here's an example of this. He also kept the feast days. Notice what it says here. Beginning in verse 19, and he came to Ephesus, and he left them there, but he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they desired him to tarry longer time with them, he consented not. They wanted him to stay. I told the folks up in Montgomery, I could relate to Paul a little bit, because I went out for the first time to Lake Tahoe this year in my travels during the feast. I haven't been out there in 17 years. I almost burst into tears when I called my wife. I was driving up that mountain road from Reno to go over the top of the mountain there. I called her. I said, "How long has it been since I have been to Tahoe?" Because I couldn't remember. And my wife relates time to how old the kids were, you know. Well, let's see. Daniel was 11 years old and he's 28. And it almost chokes me up now to even say those words. That it had been 17 years since I had seen these folks, many of them. And all the little children that I saw 17 years ago are now grown, and they're having children. And so I walked in that room, and I just got this elation of those folks there, our brethren out there in Lake Tahoe. So when it came time to leave, a few short hours later, I was reminded of this scripture where Paul said they wanted him to stay, but he said, no, I've got to go. But he bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep the feast that comes in Jerusalem. You know, people that would, if they would just simply read the Word of God, they would understand that even these New Testament writers here, like the Apostle Paul, on this first and second missionary journey, was keeping the feast days. Let's look at another example over just in chapter 20 and verse 6. Chapter 20, down in verse 6, he says, and we sailed away from Philippi. Now this is Luke, the chronologer that's writing, the author of the book of Luke. He also wrote the book of Acts. He was the one that stuck by Paul's side through all of his journeys. I don't know whether he had some little leather notepad that he had, a scroll, that he would write down little notes that where they went, because he always, and he never mentions himself by name. He said, we sailed, or we left, or we departed. But Luke was the one that was writing down where they had gone. And here he says, we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Why would Luke care to record that unless they were observing those days? In that same chapter, down in verse 16, this is when they were in Miletus, their voyage to Miletus. Down in verse 16, for Paul was determined to sail by Ephesus because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible, for him to be at Jerusalem the day of Pentecost. Over and over again is these examples in the New Testament of the Apostle Paul. And by the way, this was probably written in his third missionary journey sometime around 55 AD. Years after Jesus had died and been buried and resurrected. Plenty of time for the Apostle Paul to stand up and say, oh, those Old Testament feast days, you don't need to keep those things. Why, don't you know it's all been nailed to the cross, as they say? And yet here we find the Apostle Paul observing the days of unleavened bread, Pentecost, the fast. Remember on one occasion he said, we sailed because the fast was already past. He knew that if they sailed at that time of the year through the Mediterranean because of the storms that were coming during that time of the year in the later part of that year, that they would suffer shipwreck. And he even warned the shipmaster, and they refused to listen to him. And of course they suffered the shipwreck that landed them on the island of Malta. So he has references over and over again in the New Testament of the feast days. And of course, there's the chapter of 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, which we read during the time of the days of unleavened bread, where Paul is stating in this letter, he's going to, it's so funny, Paul is going to be resurrected someday, and he's going to say, what are you talking about, 1 Corinthians? What do you mean 1st and 2nd Corinthians? Well, it's your letter, Paul, that you wrote to the church at Corinth. He's going to say, I didn't write 2 letters to the church at Corinth. I wrote dozens of letters to the church at Corinth. But these 2 here are the only ones that are on a par with the Scripture that were preserved for us. I don't know who preserved them. Somebody did. Maybe it was John. Maybe it was Luke. And some of the writings that were preserved down through time. Maybe some of these churches preserved them over time. Evidently, copies were shared with other church groups around Paul's area that he preached. And we also know that 2 Corinthians is not 2 Corinthians, by the way. Scholars know that he refers to other letters in 1 Corinthians, that 2 Corinthians and even 1 Corinthians might not even be 1 Corinthians. But it could be 3rd or 4th or 10th. We don't know. But these are the only 2 that were rescued and preserved and inspired to be in the Word of God. But in 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, he says, purge out the old leaven that you may be a new lump as you are unleavened. And you've read those scriptures during the days of unleavened bread, and you know it would make no sense if he wasn't referring to the days of unleavened bread. But later in that same chapter there, he said, let us keep the feast, not with the leavened bread of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul kept the feast days. And he used that imagery of this time of the year in his second letter, as I call it, of Corinthians. And I'd like to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, I should say. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, what in the world is he talking about? My margin doesn't say tabernacle. My margin says tent. You can use any term you want there. Tent, tabernacle, shack, shanty, hut. But I think it's important that the Apostle Paul uses the word tent because what was he by profession? He was a tent maker. And it was easy for him to make the analogy that our body is like a tent, a temporary dwelling place. I was on one of the flights. I was talking to two ladies there that were sitting beside me. One lady was from Chicago, and one of the ladies was from California. And she was asking me, where have you been? And I told her, and she's like, boy, you travel a lot in your job, don't you? And I said, no, I'm actually up here observing the Feast of Tabernacles. The what? Oh. And then I began to tell her what we did, and I always say, when people say that, it proves their ignorance that they've never read the Bible. Because throughout the Bible is this reference to God's holy days. And they've never heard these terms like days of unleavened bread, Feast of Tabernacles. To me, they're so commonplace because I grew up hearing those. And as we talked about what, and she says, I got a Jewish friend that keeps Sukkot. I was like, oh, really? Well, do you know what that term means? It means tabernacle. It means, she goes, oh, I know. They're celebrating those Jews that were out there in the wilderness when they were brought out of the land of Egypt. I'm a little astonished that she knows that much because most people don't even know that. And I said, yeah, we do celebrate that, but also the Apostle Paul used the analogy in the New Testament that we are a tabernacle. And we are a type of temporary dwelling in whom God's Spirit dwells, and that we're someday going to be in God's family. Well, anyway, we finished up our conversation. I don't know how far the conversation went after that, other than when we were about to leave the plane, she looked at me and said, have a good tabernacles. At least some of it got in. At least some of it got in. Maybe she'll hear that term again in the future and it'll strike a chord with her. But he says, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Obviously reference here to the resurrection chapter. This is the same Apostle Paul that wrote 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter. And I'm always amazed when I do a funeral. And as I said, I've done too many funerals in my lifetime. But when I stand up there and read 1 Corinthians, and I reference John the 6th chapter where it says, I will raise him up at the last day. And I talk about, quote from Job, where it says, I will be in my grave until your wrath be past, and you will call, and I will answer. All these scriptures having to do with the resurrection. I look into the eyes of the people in those funerals, most of which are not in the church of God, and their eyes are this big around. It's like you're speaking Greek to them. It's like they're hearing something they've never heard. What are you talking about? I've always been taught we either go up or down. And you're standing there talking to me about the resurrection. And I'm just reading right out of the book, right out of the Bible. I remember the old man after that funeral, and he come hobbling up the aisle. I saw him coming. I was like, you stand there, they got the coffin, and you're standing at the end. They got the ritual, everybody gets up, and they go and proceed by the coffin and out the door. And I saw him coming. I knew he had something on his mind. And, everybody's trying to quietly make their way out. And he leaned over to me and quietly said, now you told me when you said Jesus is coming. When? I said, at the last trump. I thought that's what you said. And out the door he went, And when I went out the door, with the procession at the end, I saw him over there with a bunch of deacons, and they were standing around, and he was telling them exactly what I was saying. But maybe someday he'll understand that great knowledge. So if we be clothed with, we shall not be found naked, for we that are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened, not that we are unclothed, but clothed upon with mortality, that we might be swallowed up of life. And he that has wrought us in this self-same thing is God, who also has given unto us the earnest of his Spirit. I found out a couple of months ago that I'm going to be a grandpa, and I'm pretty happy about that. Thank you. And just like a young lady, and we've had this analogy for years, Mr. Armstrong used to use this over and over again, that like a young girl that's been married and she's got a new child that's underway, we have within our temporary dwelling place here, this temporary tabernacle, she has a child that's someday going to be born. And we can't wait. She sends me these pictures and says, the baby is the size of a jalapeno pepper. So I started calling it Nacho. And a little later, she sent me another picture of a beet. I guess she gets this information off the internet. I don't know. But she said the baby's the size of a beet, and from now till the time it's born in April, it's going to double in size every week. Well, boy, that just really warmed my heart. I was thinking, middle of April might be around the holy day season. What a grand time that's going to be. Next year at the feast, I'm going to have a 6-month-old grandchild, and that really makes me happy. But as we have God's Spirit within us, just like that young woman that is about to have a child, that is someday, it's growing now and forming and being nourished in the church, within the body of the church, the mother, and is someday going to be born into the family of God. And that's a marvelous example, I believe. 2 Peter, the first chapter, Peter used that same analogy of the body. And maybe we'll try to finish up here. I know we got a lot to cover here today in this late afternoon service. 2 Peter, the first chapter, Peter used this same analogy. And down in verse 12, he said, "Wherefore I will be negligent to always put you in remembrance of these things, that you know them and be established in the present truth. Yea, I think it meet, as long as I am in this tabernacle, to stir you up and putting you in remembrance." Peter wrote this while he was on death row. He wrote it while he was on death row. He says, "Knowing that I shortly must put off this my tabernacle, even as our Lord Jesus Christ has showed me." Jesus said to him, you're going to gird yourself. When you were young, you girded yourself and you went wherever you wanted to go. But when you're old, someone else is going to gird you, and you're going to stretch forth your hands, and they're going to lead you where you don't want to go. When I read that this week in preparation for the feast, I thought, how would you like to know that you're going to be a martyr? Peter knew that his whole life, didn't he? His whole ministry, he knew that he was going to suffer martyrdom. And here he is at that moment. And what does he do? Does he wallow in self-pity? No. He gets out his pen and he writes a letter of encouragement to the church. And he tells them to hang on. Don't give up. Don't give up the truths that you've learned. I tell you, brethren, there's going to come a day when these men are going to be resurrected. And I personally do not want to stand there in that day and have those men ask me, what happened to the church? Where did it all go? Where did it lead? Where was the final witness? Who did the final work? I can't personally accept the fact that we just gave up and walked away. I personally cannot accept that fact, and I know you feel the same way. I want to stand there in that day and be able to tell those men who bore in their very bodies the stripes, the Apostle Paul, that was beaten and caned and even stoned to death for the truth that he had. Think of all the apostles and the men of God and women of God who served time in prison. From all the way back to Joseph's day, to Jeremiah, to men and women in the New Testament, such as Peter and James, who lost his head, and John, and some of the other disciples that were there. serve time in prison, maybe up to 2 or 3 years at a time, for the sake of the gospel message. I can't stand the thought of being there at the time of their resurrection and them saying that they just all gave up and walked away. No way. No way could we do that. What about the future? Jesus said there would be a time of great tribulation. He said that there would become a time of the heavenly signs in the day of the Lord. And we read in the book of Zechariah that in that day his feet shall stand upon the Mount of Olives. That they're going to worship the King that is going to reign on the earth. And that they're going to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles in the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. I think that it is a wonderful history, the history of the nation of Israel, that it should be taught in all the schools in our land. Their rich heritage stands as an eternal example of God's dealings with mankind. If one were to study the origin of the identity of the nation of Israel, you would discover a wealth of information that pertains to our world today, including God's commandments, His laws that tell us how to rightly govern ourselves, as well as His holy days like the Feast of Tabernacles you're observing here today, which reveal God's plan and purpose for our lives. It would unlock also many of the prophecies about our future, such as the ones we read in Zechariah, the 14th chapter. Our destiny as members in God's family and outside and apart from this temporary tabernacle in which we dwell. I pray God would guide our understanding and those that hear this message and help us to see His plan and to bring us to that day where He will dwell with us in His kingdom. I love every one of you, and I pray that y'all have a wonderful feast, and I hope that these days will be kind to you and you'll have a prosperous journey home, and God bless every single one of you. Thank you.
I feel like all-day church, isn't it? Well, I guess these are things beyond our control sometimes. With all our travel, Stan and I could probably just tell stories and of the things that happened to us and happened to other people along the trip. I hope that y'all have had a chance to digest not only the contents of the magazine, but I don't know but what there aren't more contents on the cover than there are inside. So don't be tempted to just say, oh yeah, Britain's leaving the EU, and okay, and then page through it, because there really maybe an hour or more of entertainment and information on that cover, and I'm still finding things that I didn't notice in the first place that are not only true, but very artfully and, well, just illustrated in such a way that cracks me up. You know, a joke can't be really funny unless it's mostly true, or at least it has to have an element of truth in order to be funny. And this is both funny and true. And I think that you all know that it is something that you, if you've been in the church for any amount of time, have expected all along. Something that was, bored into my brain since childhood. I can't remember a time when I thought that England was going to be part of a European Union in the last days. I'm beginning to wonder if anybody's going to be a part of this current European Union. I think they're in the process of committing utter suicide and pretty much demanding that the population go along with it, be happy about it, and celebrate their own suicide. Does that sound anything familiar, like kind of the pressure that's being brought to bear on all of us? They want us to commit national suicide. I'm not sure they don't want us to commit personal suicide and be happy about it all at the same time. I don't know how many of you saw this report. Poor Stan, he's had to hear so many of my stories over and over. But anyway, I can't help that. I've had to listen to his stories too. Listen, sorry for having a little fun at Stan's expense. Stan is the hardest working, most underpaid, faithful individual, and I know that he is beloved not only by you people. Sorry, Stan, just plug your ears for a second, would you? Not only by you people, but all around this country that see his sermons, and I'm telling you, I get to do the fun part. Stan has to do the hard work. But anyway, I think that is largely true. I don't know how many of you saw this news report. I know that your rear end has gone to sleep already, so try to flex a little and we'll get through this in a few minutes. I don't know how many of you saw this report not long ago that the United States is now regarded as the 36th freest country in the world. We're now number 36. Every place else is a lot freer than the United States. You know who number one is, or at least right at the top of the list? And I heard this on the ABC news break not more than 2 weeks ago. Maybe some of you heard it because I heard it between some of the radio programs that are on a station that we've got in Tyler. You know who's number one? Sweden, where they have taken in hordes and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these immigrants that have completely made it impossible to go out and enjoy an evening on the town. You can't really do that in Sweden. That's how free it is in Sweden. The only problem is it's free, but the citizens aren't free. The immigrants are free. And when you get a chance, don't take my word for it. I mean, I'm fixing to draw your attention to an aspect of this illustration on the cover, where you've got a guy in Islamic garb with a B, on the European Union ship, and he's marching he's making a guy walk the plank at the end of a sword. He's marching him off into the sea where a shark is waiting, and the shark is labeled political correctness. And so the little guy with the Swedish flag is being marched at sword point into the drink. Sweden is so free that they are now allowed to fly the ISIS battle flag, and nobody can say anything about it. If somebody says something about it, you know what that is? That's a hate crime. You must be Islamophobic. And it is beyond the realm of discussion or conjecture, because people are being tried under hate crime laws if they say anything about the onslaught in their country. I don't usually bring a lot of scriptures, and I didn't this time, but I did bring a couple or three. And one of them that I referred to in Panama City and in where I've been elsewhere is in Isaiah 65 and verse 3. And of course, it's talking about the nation of Israel, and it is the prophet Isaiah, and he is speaking of a people who provoke God continuously. Now, thank goodness, we're free enough that we're here keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. I don't know of any place on the European continent. Maybe there is some place. Maybe there is some remnant of worldwide somewhere where they're still gathering to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. I know that we have a group in Scotland that is keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, but that's part of the UK, and the UK just sailed away from the European Union, and I am so proud of them. I am way more proud of them than I am of us. And I don't mean you in this room. I'm just talking about the people of the United States who have allowed themselves to be steamrolled and run over for the last, well, I could say 8 years, but I might as well say 12, or even maybe 16. We have been lulled along. You better not say anything. You better not complain. Better not be singled out, because they will come. They will come to get you. And I imagine they're going to come to get us eventually. As we live in the midst of a society that feels so self-righteous about all their heinous sins that are an absolute stench in the nostrils of our Almighty God. And they're so self-righteous about their sin. And this business about homosexuality. Homosexual marriage, the Supreme Court has deemed that it's an American right. It's like, oh yeah, really? That's why the Revolutionary War was fought? So men could marry each other? Is that really what it was all about? I got a little story for you. Actually, I got one or two. But, it's Bike Week in Panama City, and I don't know if you've heard, Stan, they haven't said anything to me about it, but, there were already several Harleys blatting up and down the streets, and they get the loudest pipes. I mean, they'll break the windows right out of your car as they go by. Anyway, this group of bikers was heading down the highway there in Florida, and as they approached a bridge, they started to slow down because they saw there was a girl standing atop a column looking like she was fixing to jump. So the bike slowed down and finally came to a stop before they got too close. I mean, they didn't want the racket to scare her off the bridge or whatever. And so the leader of this bike gang, a fairly big old burly guy in a leather vest and a bunch of patches and everything, gets off his motor and walks up and he gets fairly close to her and he says, "What are you doing?" And she says, "I'm about to commit suicide." Well, he didn't want to seem overly insensitive. He didn't say, "Well, okay, well, we're going to watch," or something. But he walked up to her and he said, "Listen, before you jump," he said, "would you do me a favor and give me one last kiss?" So she said, "Well, I guess I can do that." Well, it turned out to be a long and deep and passionate kiss. And the guy said to her, he said, "I don't know why you'd want to kill yourself." He said, "You obviously have a lot of feeling and a lot of emotion." And he said, "That kiss reveals, if you ask me, a special talent." He said, "Why on earth would you want to kill yourself?" And she said, "Well, it's because my parents hate it when I dress up like a girl." And I'm not even going to tell you what happens after that. But here it is absolutely sacrosanct in our country, a people who provoke God continuously, day and night, and feel ever so self-righteous about it. I'll tell you, I'm a little irritated that we're being lectured day in and day out on the mainstream networks by a bunch of homosexuals. Who are they to determine how we look at things, how we think, and how our minds work, how the news and how developments are to be analyzed? But here you have on CNN, come prime time, you got the gay anchor, and I know his family's Richard and Cooter Brown. Well, Cooter Brown should be so lucky. But I know he's comes from a very, very wealthy and well-educated family. And, he tells us what to think and how to think it. And then he hands it off to the next anchor in the next segment of prime time, I guess from 7 to 8, and then from 8 to 9, you get your other homosexual anchor, and then you get the homosexual guests. And on Fox, they're doing the same thing. I don't know that they have any anchors, but they definitely got their flirt-faced guests that they bring on to tick me off nearly every day. And they feel they are so righteous. Why? They know what they're talking about, and nobody else does. Well, it's amazing that we're allowed to convene like this, and I'm allowed to stand up here and talk like this in this day and age, because I wouldn't be getting away with it in the freedom of Sweden, would not be getting away with it probably anywhere in Europe. But as long as we've got a commission to warn and to point out the sins of society, and as long as we've got the freedom to gather and observe God as He commanded us to, that's what we're going to do. I know that You know, the most righteous thing, we know that in the end time there's going to be a conglomeration of 10 nations. I don't believe it's the 23 of the European Union or even a whittled down version. But I have a feeling that all of the sentiments that they hold dear are still going to be held dear when the final 10 arise. I believe the Pope has had a tremendous amount to do, this Pope, with the destruction of Europe. And it is being destroyed. Culturally, economically, every which way. Does anybody here, I brought it to your attention last year, and maybe the year before, but does anybody remember Pope Francis's first act? It was to declare refugees basically the most important Christian cause. He made a big deal, not only with his statements, not only with his writings, but of course he went to the island of Lesbos to wash the feet of the refugees. You know, that seemed like, well, goofball. Silly thing for him to do. But then right after that, what happens to Europe? Angela Merkel. Oh, here she is. She's in the crow's nest at the top. And she's screaming, more refugees, more refugees. You notice the little Islamic flag is flying on top of the EU flag, on top of the ship. I think the Pope had something to do with the onslaught that is swamping Europe. I had another thought, and I haven't heard anybody but me explain it this way, and you can tell me that I'm wrong or off base if you wish, but I don't think so. This other scripture in Isaiah, which is Isaiah 3 and verse 12, it says, as for my people, you know this, you don't have to look it up, but you can if you want. As for my people, women rule over them, and children are their oppressors. Well, I don't know what's about to happen to us, but I know what's happened to Europe. And I think it is pretty interesting that you have got a woman from a non-Israelitish country, Germany, which is ruling over the Israelitish nations of Europe. Holland, the Netherlands, Sweden, France, and so on and so forth, Norway. And until recently, I guess actually it's still going on, England has not legally separated yet. Although the vote has been cast and that's what they intend to do, it's not legal yet. And I don't know if you'll see this, the liberals in England and in Europe would like you to believe that they're not going to get away with it. They're going to put a stop to this Brexit business one way or the other. And you'll see the occasional headline that leads to that conclusion. I saw one the other day, and so I went ahead and Michael and Melody sent me a tablet that they don't use anymore, so I can sort of try to keep up with the news along the way. So I began looking at this legal challenge that has said that no, the whole British government is going to have to take a vote in Parliament before the Prime Minister can actually execute the terms of division from Europe. As I read on, I realized that it's a stockbroker and a hairdresser that are bringing the suit, so maybe it's not as serious as they'd like us to believe. But isn't it interesting that you have got a woman of non-Israelitish heritage who is absolutely turning Europe on its head? I think it's a little interesting that we've had a president of non-Israelitish heritage that has turned our nation on its head, but don't get me started on that, because it may just be a warm-up for what is yet to come. I got another story. I told you I had a couple of stories. This one happened to me as I was getting on the airplane on my way to Myrtle Beach in Atlanta. So we're walking down the catwalk, the sky bridge that you walk down to get on an airplane. And the traffic had backed up. They're kind of slow getting through the door and putting their carry-on luggage, on the cart and what have you. And I heard a couple talking behind me and saying, boy, you can already feel the humidity, just seeping through the cracks of this sky bridge. And I said, it's probably going to be more humid where we're going by far. And we talked a little bit, and I said, well, you folks must be from somewhere that's cool and dry. And they said, well, yeah, South Dakota. I said, South Dakota? Well, isn't that something? And I turned to the gentleman, I said, do the Muslims outnumber y'all up there yet? And he said, no, I don't believe we have that many of them yet. I said, well, you might. They've pretty well been sneaking them into these places and not telling anybody. He said, well, they tell my wife. She takes care of their health care. I looked at her and I said, so you're actually responsible for help bringing them in? She said, well, I take care of their health care. And I said, well, I'd take care of a one-way ticket. But anyway, that was the last thing I said. I wish I'd have been a little quicker on my feet because, you know, I wish I would have had the presence of mind to say, you know what? We want our suicide bombers to be in tip-top shape. We don't want any vitamin deficient mass shootings going on. You know, we want those people to be 100% healthy and really feeling good when they carry out their acts of terror against us. I can guarantee you, folks, we've seen it already. I mean, how many examples? There have been 5, 10, how many in the last 2 years? And sometimes they tend to come in pretty quick succession. You know, Boston, San Bernardino, Florida, Tulsa, beheadings, you know, pressure cookers and mass shootings in malls. Sometimes they won't even tell us the origins of the perpetrator. You notice that? They did that, they pulled that stunt up in Washington State, I think it was Washington, where there was an Islamic terrorist attack, and they acted like they didn't know what they were talking about for about 3 or 4 days, talking all around the issue, you know. And then finally, it's Abdullah or Muhammad or whoever he was, but it was an immigrant from the Middle East who is over here carrying out the instructions of Allah. You know, we've been lectured, well, we can't slam the door in the face of all these women and children. That's not who we are. I'm so sick of being told who we are by people who don't even know who we are. They won't even admit, I've said this before and I'm going to say it again. They won't admit that we are descended from Israel. You know, Stan gave you some of that history, and I mean the number of times that God intervened on behalf of Israel and also intervened in the institution and in the makeup and the establishment of this nation is a mind-boggling thing. We could go for probably 2 hours just on the incidents where God intervened on behalf of George Washington personally and on behalf of his army. But there are numerous examples. And some of them have been in documentaries on television. You don't have to listen to me to find that out. You don't have to listen to me to know that the fog came in such thickness that they were able to escape when they were trapped in New York and escape across the river. You don't have to listen to me to find out that George Washington had holes, 5 or 6 bullet holes in his jacket, and yet he never even got injured in a battle where he was riding around back and forth on the front. You want to tell me God wasn't involved in that? Especially when this man was seeking his guidance on a daily basis? He most assuredly was. Well, that doesn't matter to our present day leaders, does it? It doesn't matter to our haughty senators and congressmen who try to tell us what's right and what's wrong. We've got a mighty work to do. And you know I don't pull any punches. You know my dad wouldn't be pulling any punches either. But he'd probably get shot down because he had a big name. He had a big face, he had a big personality, and he probably wouldn't have got away with near what we're doing now, honestly. And I'm almost, you know, I mourn my dad's passing very, very deeply. And I'm more surprised than you are that we are still here, that we're still intact. But we are. But I guarantee you, my dad would have been very forthright, and I'm not sure he could have even continued his television broadcast in the atmosphere that we now live in, because I know how I felt, and I knew how passionate he was. And some of the things that we've been subjected to are so blinding that it defies all logic and imagination. And I have a feeling that if Dad had still been doing a television program, I'd have been doing a whole bunch of editing. We know that there is coming a time when the word won't be able to go out. And you can see that this political correctness, this hate crime atmosphere that is generated in Europe, this one worldism, this one world Christianity that they're trying to invoke, this one world political view, this one world economy that they would like to create. I have a feeling that the one world economy is going to come out of an economic disaster the likes of which we can't even imagine. I know that the major financial institutions in Europe are in deep trouble. The European Central Bank is loaded down with a bunch of bad debt. They have to keep acting like it's going to be okay and like they're going to get paid off on these debts someday. And Deutsche Bank, one of the most powerful financial institutions on earth, loaded down with junk bonds, with bad debts, with debts from nations that have got an upside down gross domestic product who are never going to be able to pay them back. You see the little Greek who's vomiting over the side of the ship? Well, Greek has gotten a little seasick on the ship of the European Union. They got rid of their currency, and it's been nothing but trash in the streets and people out of work and people eating out of garbage cans like you'd see in Venezuela. I'm not sure some of those that purport to want to lead us wouldn't like to see us eating out of garbage cans. Thank goodness we live in a blessed country that God gave as the birthright to the Israelitish nations and to the descendants of Jacob. You know, we're talking about a time of martyrdom and so forth. They're going to have a little trouble. They're going to have a little more trouble making martyrs out of us than maybe they did some of the ancient apostles. They didn't have concealed carry. And I don't want to shoot anybody, but they better leave my little granddaughter alone. Because I very desperately, I want to begin by saying I am incredibly thankful, and I bet you are too, for the kind of freedoms and the kind of safety that we've enjoyed growing up and living our lives in this country. Very, very thankful for the carefree atmosphere where we could get on a bicycle and ride until we were lost and then find our way back home. Or we could walk into the woods and over the hill and dale and not worry about a thing. I want my little grandchild to have that kind of safety and that kind of freedom to enjoy herself and to learn and to experience. And I guarantee the world that they are creating for us is not going to allow for that kind of safety and freedom. You're liable to have some dude in a burqa charging out of the woods. And I say that advisedly. I don't know if you realize, maybe you've seen the news today. They're fleeing Mosul in burqas, these tough, brave jihadis. They've donned their burqas and they're mincing off into the desert. Yeah, those brave jihadis who hide behind the women and children. I am so sick of watching them dig little babies out of concrete rubble and display them for the cameras. Look what you've done. Look what you've done, Europe. Look what you've done, America. Look what you're doing, Russia. Well, if you sons of dogs didn't hide behind your women and children, maybe you wouldn't have to dig them out of the rubble. You cowardly bastards. Sorry, that's what's in the Bible. Yeah, they're using the men and women for human shields, and it's nothing new. They do it every single time, don't they? They go hide behind their women and children and pound their chests. Oh yeah, one of us is worth 30 or 40 Israelis. I used to hear that stuff on the east side of Jerusalem when I lived over there. Oh yes, one Arab man can kill and take care of 200, they don't remember, 500 Israelis. Oh yes, we are very strong. It's like, yeah, you're full of camel. I'm sick of them. I am frankly sick of their culture. I'm sick that they're better than we are, that Islam is sacrosanct and Christianity, you can just spit all over it. Even the goofy versions of Christianity. Oh yeah, they're going to occupy Wall Street, the Catholic Church? They want to do that? Yep. Oh yeah, they had a plan. It's all in their own language, writing back and forth about how they want to start a big demonstration. They need to bring democracy to the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church has, the Pope isn't cool with sodomy or abortion. He hadn't got there yet. I mean, he's going to destroy the West with all this immigration claptrap, but, they still got a few standards that their history, they got a long history, goes all the way back to 300 years this side of Christ. Stan was just mentioning that. It wasn't the first Christian church. The first Christian church is the one you're sitting in. They came up with their Christian church to try to amalgamate all of the practices of the heathen 325 years later, and that's the one that the Pope is in charge of. Well, the sacrosanct policies and activities and practices of our nation and of our people, at least the mainstream, are a stench in the nostrils of God. And I really don't think that a majority of the American people are buying into it. I just think they're cowed by peer pressure, by the media. Nobody's going to stick their head up. I have a feeling that they probably have discussions like we're having right now in their private moments. I don't despise the people of this country, but I despise what the leadership is doing to them. And I really despise the fact that they're not speaking up, that they're not standing against it and standing as strong as we are. But I tell you what, folks, you can bet your bottom dollar that we're not going to stop. The letters are going to continue to be hotter than blue blazes. And the magazines are going to continue to be as forthright and pertinent and direct as we can possibly make them. Because I know that we have your support, and I know that we have God's blessing. I want to say one thing before I sit down. I've been up here way too long already. But we had at least 2 and maybe 3 couples up in Indiana that I've never seen before. We may have had some in Myrtle Beach. I didn't have long to the larger crowd there, a little over 100. I mean, that crowd in Myrtle Beach is down this year, but the interstate's partially underwater, and several towns don't have power yet, and have had all kinds of people have had damage, and you can only imagine, flooding and carpet soaked and furniture ruined and the walls full of moisture and so forth. So it's understandable that our numbers are a little bit down in Myrtle Beach this year. But we do have some brand new people. Well, they're not brand new. They're just as old as the rest of us. Been around forever, been in the Church of God. And I'm not sure which one of these outfits they were hooked up with. Could easily have been Philadelphia, could have easily been Living, or I'm going to call up there and ask someone to find out, because I'd like to know the details of their story. But they indicated to me that they've been abused, they've been jerked around, they've been ordered around for long enough, and they wanted to know if it was okay if they stayed there and attended the feast with us. And I said, is it ever? We don't have any weird holy man jerking people around like they do in several of these organizations. Stan's not an apostle, and he's never going to make that claim, or me and him are fixing to part company. And if I were to ever make such a claim, me and him would still be fixing to part company. And Dr. Rick's ain't going to do it neither. Not a single one of us is ever going to make that claim. I don't even think my granddad would have, except that he had other people calling the shots for him when he wasn't in a position to, mind his own business. And that's about as polite a way as I can think of to say it. But we are not going to slow down until God sees to it that we're shut down. And it may happen as a result of our government. It may happen as a result of a federal agency. It may happen as a result of laws. Who knows what kind of hate crimes they might institute, depending on what kind of Congress we get in the future, what kind of Supreme Court we get in the future. But until then, you are a part of an organization that is going to cry aloud, that is going to spare not, and is going to tear them a new one. And so thank you very much for coming. I know that it's not easy. I know that a lot of you have probably endured difficulty and of various kinds of financial and practical and so forth and so on. But I appreciate the fact that you folks are dedicated and loyal, and that you have supported what we have continued to do. And I thank you for that. And I ask God to be with you and to bless and protect all of you with whatever we're facing in the days ahead. See you next time.